The signal in the dark. The moon was dead. Ronan knew that much. The abandoned lunar colony stretched before him, cold, forgotten, and silent. It had been over a decade since anyone had set foot here. The metal structures were rusting, their once pristine surfaces covered in layers of dust. He had no reason to be here except for one thing, money. Scavenging old wrecks wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep his ship running. And out here, in the outer colonies, that was all that mattered. His boots crunched against the brittle, frozen dust as he moved carefully between the skeletal remains of buildings. He adjusted the cracked visor of his helmet, scanning his surroundings. Then his comm unit crackled. Static filled his ears, a harsh and grating sound in the otherwise empty world. He frowned, tapping the side of his helmet to adjust the frequency. It had to be interference from the colony's long-dead systems. Then. This is. Sigh. The voice was faint. Distorted. Desperate. Please, anyone, trapped. Ronan stopped in his tracks. His breath fogged up his visor as he tried to process what he had just heard. A distress beacon? No way. There was no one here. There shouldn't be anyone here. He turned slowly, adjusting his wrist device to track the source. A weak signal flickered on the screen, pulsing in the distance. It wasn't far. His gut told him to ignore it. Nothing good came from investigating old distress calls. It was probably just an automated loop, a ghost of the past, stuck replaying a message from someone long dead. But that voice, it had sounded real. He hesitated for only a moment before heading toward the signal. The old colony's central complex loomed ahead, half buried in the moon dust. A massive steel door stood at the entrance, rusted but still intact. Ronan placed his hand on the panel beside it. The screen flickered weakly before displaying a simple prompt. Access denied. He sighed, reaching into his pack. A scavenger's best friend, an old hacking device. He placed it against the panel, and after a few moments, the screen glitched. Override accepted. With a groan of protest, the door slid open, revealing a dark corridor beyond. A foul, metallic smell filled his helmet. He hesitated. There were no footprints in the dust. No sign that anyone had been here recently. Then where had the signal come from? He pressed forward. The deeper he went, the worse it got. The walls were lined with flickering lights, their glow barely illuminating the path. Old security drones lay motionless, their once lethal weapons covered in dust. Then he saw it. A pod. A massive, glass containment pod stood in the center of the room, surrounded by shattered equipment. Its surface was covered in frost, but a faint blue glow pulsed from within. He stepped closer. Inside. A woman. She was curled up, unconscious. Her skin had an almost iridescent shimmer, glowing faintly under the pod's failing lights. White strands of hair floated around her, suspended in the preservation fluid. Not human. Ronan's pulse quickened. Alien technology was rare. The black market would pay a fortune for something like this. But, selling a living being? His gaze flicked to the control panel beside the pod. The text was in an unfamiliar language, but one symbol stood out, emergency release. He clenched his jaw. If he pressed that button, there was no going back. He took a deep breath. And then he made his choice. He pressed it. A fragile alliance. The moment Ronan pressed the button, a harsh alarm blared through the chamber. The containment pod hissed, releasing a cloud of freezing mist into the stale air. The blue glow flickered as the preservation fluid drained, leaving the alien woman slumped against the glass. Ronan stepped back, his pulse hammering in his ears. What the hell did I just do? With a final click, the pod unsealed, and the glass door creaked open. For a moment, nothing happened. Then. Her eyes snapped open. A deep, unnatural blue, glowing with an eerie light. She gasped, her body jerking forward as if she had been drowning. She collapsed onto the cold metal floor, coughing violently. Ronan hesitated. She was weak, too weak to be a threat. He took a cautious step closer. "Hey, can you understand me?" Her breathing was ragged, her fingers trembling as she pushed herself up. Her skin shimmered in the dim light, shifting between shades of silver and pale lavender. She turned her head sharply toward him, her glowing eyes locking onto his. Then, she lunged. Ronan barely had time to react before she grabbed his wrist in a vice-like grip. His instincts kicked in, and he wrenched himself free, stumbling backward. "Whoa, easy." He raised his hands in surrender. "I just..." Her body tensed, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was terrified. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, as if realizing her own weakness, she slumped back against the pod, her limbs shaking too much to hold herself up. Ronan exhaled. "Look, I don't know who you are, but I just saved your life," he said carefully. "You were trapped in that thing. You were sending a distress signal." Her expression flickered with confusion. She touched her throat as if struggling to speak. When she finally did, her voice was hoarse but sharp. "Who are you?" "Ronan." He took another step forward. "Who are you?" A pause. Then, barely above a whisper. "Silena." Ronan nodded. "All right, Silena. Can you stand?" She clenched her jaw, trying to push herself up again. Her legs barely supported her weight before she collapsed back down. She was completely drained. Ronan hesitated, then took a knee beside her. "Okay, I got you." Before she could protest, he slipped an arm around her shoulders and helped her to her feet. She was lighter than he expected, her body unnaturally cold against his. She stiffened at the contact, but she didn't resist. "We need to get out of here," Ronan said, glancing around. "This place isn't exactly friendly." Silena's breathing was still shallow. "How long?" He frowned. "How long what?" She swallowed. "Since I was left here." Ronan glanced at the cracked monitors on the walls, flickering with unreadable alien script. 10 years, he said. Silena's eyes widened. Her grip on him tightened. "They left me." Her voice was barely a whisper, but Ronan could hear the raw pain in it. "Yeah," he muttered. "Guess they did." A long silence. Then Silena's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Ronan saw something else flicker behind them. Rage. She wasn't just lost. She wasn't just abandoned. She was betrayed. And now, whoever had done it would regret it. Hunted by shadows. Ronan tightened his grip around Silena as she struggled to keep her balance. Though she was light, her body was trembling violently, drained from years of stasis. "We need to get moving," he muttered, glancing around the ruined facility. The walls were covered in vines, shattered glass littered the floor, and flickering screens cast eerie blue glows in the darkness. This place had been abandoned for years. But something about it still felt wrong. Silena's breathing was shallow, her glowing eyes darting around the corridor. "I can feel them," she whispered. Ronan frowned. "Feel who?" A cold gust swept through the hallway, making the broken lights above flicker. The shadows along the walls seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting in ways they shouldn't. Silena's grip tightened around Ronan's arm. "They know I'm awake." Ronan instinctively reached for the blaster at his side. "Who the hell are they?" Silena didn't answer. Instead, she took a slow, unsteady step forward. Her silver skin shimmered slightly as if reacting to something unseen. "We don't have much time," she muttered. "They will come." Ronan clenched his jaw. He didn't like the sound of that. "All right, then let's go," he said, moving forward. My ship isn't far, but... A sound stopped him. A distant clicking noise, like sharp claws scraping against metal. Silena's body tensed. Too late, she whispered. The shadows along the walls rippled. Then, they moved. From the darkness, twisted figures began to emerge, tall, thin creatures with elongated limbs and hollow, featureless faces. Their bodies shimmered like black mist, shifting and warping as they slithered from the walls. Ronan's stomach dropped. What are those things? Silena's voice was tight. Echoes. The creatures twitched violently, their limbs cracking unnaturally as they turned toward Silena. And then, they rushed forward. Ronan didn't think, he just reacted. He grabbed Silena and pulled her behind him, raising his blaster. With a sharp pull of the trigger, a bolt of plasma shot toward the closest creature. It passed right through it. The echo didn't even flinch. Oh, that's bad, Ronan muttered. Silena grabbed his wrist. You can't fight them like that. Well, I'd love a better plan, but we're kind of out of options here. The echoes closed in, their movements jerky and unnatural. The air grew thick with a suffocating pressure, and Silena's breathing turned ragged. Ronan could feel it now too, something was trying to pull them under. Silena clenched her jaw. No choice, she muttered. Before Ronan could ask what she meant, she stepped toward the creatures. Her body pulsed with light. The echoes hesitated. Then, Silena lifted her hand, and a wave of pure energy burst outward. The force sent Ronan staggering back, and the echoes screamed, a high, distorted wail that made his skull ache. The shadows reeled back, twisting in agony as Silena's power burned through them. For the first time, Ronan saw fear in their movements. They fled. Silena collapsed to her knees. Ronan didn't hesitate, he rushed to her side, grabbing her before she hit the floor. Her breathing was ragged, her body weak. The glow that had radiated from her was already fading. Hey, stay with me, Ronan said, shaking her slightly. Silena's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Not enough, she whispered. They will come again. Ronan glanced back at the now empty hallway. He had no doubt she was right. They weren't safe yet. Then we better hurry, he muttered. Because I have a feeling next time, they won't be so easy to scare off. With Silena leaning heavily against him, he pressed forward, heart pounding. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. But one thing was certain, this was only the beginning. Escape into the unknown. Ronan could feel the tension in Silena's body as they moved cautiously through the ruined corridors. She was barely staying on her feet, but she refused to stop. The exit should be close, he murmured, scanning the flickering map display on his wrist. Silena's breaths were shallow. Your ship, how far? Not far, he assured her. But if those shadow freaks show up again, we're in trouble. Silena's grip tightened on his arm. They will. Ronan swallowed a curse. He didn't doubt her, not after what he'd seen. Those things, echoes, she had called them, were like living nightmares. And his weapons were useless against them. The corridors twisted, leading them deeper into the abandoned facility. The walls were rusted, wires dangled from the ceiling, and strange symbols were carved into the metal. Ronan didn't like the way Silena's eyes lingered on those markings. You know what these are? He asked. Silena hesitated. Bindings. Ronan frowned. Bindings for what? She turned to him, her silver eyes reflecting the dim lights. For me. A chill ran down his spine. Before he could press her for more, the air around them shifted. A sudden, suffocating presence pressed against his skull. Silena gasped, stumbling against the wall. Ronan didn't hesitate, he grabbed her, hoisting her into his arms. Nope. No time for that. We're getting out of here. The shadows along the walls twitched. Then, they moved. The echoes were back. Ronan didn't stop to think. He ran. The chase. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, the emergency lights flickering weakly. Behind him, the echoes crawled from the walls, their twisted forms jerking unnaturally. They didn't run. They slid. Like liquid darkness, they poured through the corridor, their hollow faces turning toward him. Silena buried her face against his chest, her body trembling. Faster. Ronan cursed under his breath. Working on it. The door ahead was already partially open, an old maintenance hatch that led straight outside. If he could just. A hand shot out from the darkness, clawed fingers reaching for his leg. Ronan jumped, narrowly avoiding its grasp. He hit the ground hard, rolling with Silena in his arms. The echoes screamed. A wave of cold slammed into him, like an unseen force trying to drag him under. Silena reacted. She pushed away from him, her hands glowing. Get back. A pulse of energy blasted outward, and the echoes reeled, their forms distorting violently. Ronan didn't hesitate. He grabbed her wrist and ran. They burst through the maintenance hatch, into the open air. And for the first time in what felt like hours, Ronan could breathe. The landing site. The facility was buried in the middle of a wasteland, gray dust stretched for miles, broken only by jagged cliffs and the wreckage of old ships. And there, sitting on a cracked landing pad, was Ronan's ship. The Nightfall. A battered but reliable cruiser, covered in scratches from 1,000 battles. It wasn't pretty, but it was home. Ronan sprinted for the ramp, his boots kicking up dust. Silena gasped. The echoes. I know. He reached the control panel at the base of the ramp and slammed his hand against it. For a second, nothing. Then, with a hiss, the ramp began to lower. But the echoes weren't done. They surged from the facility, spilling into the open wasteland like a wave of darkness. Ronan hauled Silena up the ramp, shoving her inside just as the shadows lunged. He slammed his fist against the emergency close button. The ramp sealed shut. A second later, impact. The ship shook as the echoes slammed against its hull. The metal groaned under the pressure, frost spreading across the windows as the creatures clawed at the exterior. Ronan staggered to the pilot's seat, hands flying over the controls. Come on, come on. The engines roared to life. Outside, the echoes screamed. Then, with a final burst of energy, the ship lifted off. They broke free. The silence after the storm. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The ship drifted through the atmosphere, the desolate planet growing smaller beneath them. Silena sagged in her seat, eyes half-lidded. We made it. Ronan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Yeah. Somehow. He turned to her. She was pale, exhaustion written across her face. You okay? Silena hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. I will be. Ronan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. He had so many questions. What were those creatures? Why had Silena been locked away? And why the hell did he get the feeling that this wasn't over? But for now. They were safe. For now. Revelations in the void. The Nightfall cruised through the darkness of space, its engines humming softly. The once chaotic rush of escape had settled into an eerie silence. Inside the cockpit, Ronan sat in the pilot's chair, his eyes flicking between the ship's instruments and the woman resting across from him. Silena looked fragile now. The fierce determination she'd shown during their escape had melted away, leaving behind a woman barely holding herself together. She was staring out at the endless void, her silver eyes distant. You gonna tell me what those things were? Ronan finally broke the silence. Silena inhaled slowly. Echoes. You already told me that, Ronan said, leaning forward. What are they? Her fingers tightened around the edge of her seat. The remnants of something that should have died long ago. That's vague. Silena exhaled sharply. Because the truth is worse than you think. Ronan frowned. Try me. She turned her gaze to him. The echoes were my people. A cursed legacy. Ronan stiffened. Your people. But they weren't always like that, she interrupted. Once, they were alive. They ruled among the stars, their empire stretching across galaxies. But they were obsessed with power. They experimented with forces beyond their understanding. Ronan's stomach twisted. What kind of experiments? She hesitated. They wanted to conquer death. He let out a low breath. Yeah, that never goes well. No, it didn't. Her voice was heavy with grief. They tried to bind their souls to the fabric of existence itself. To make themselves eternal. Ronan's skin prickled. And instead, they became those things. Silena nodded. The ritual failed. Instead of eternal life, they became trapped in the space between existence and oblivion. They lost their bodies, their minds, all that remained was hunger. They cannot create. They cannot be. They can only consume. Ronan shook his head. And you? How did you survive? Silena looked away. Because I was never meant to be like them. The last survivor. Ronan narrowed his eyes. You were different from the start. She nodded. I was born after the fall. I am the last of my kind, but I am not like them. Something about the way she said it made Ronan pause. You sure about that? He asked carefully. She flinched, her fingers curling into fists. I don't know. The raw uncertainty in her voice unsettled him. Ronan leaned back in his chair, exhaling. So that facility, it wasn't a prison for the echoes. It was a prison for you. Silena nodded. They feared that I would become like them. And would you? Her silver eyes met his, filled with quiet pain. I don't want to. Ronan ran a hand down his face. Damn. This was bigger than he'd thought. He had assumed he was just helping a woman escape from some nightmarish monsters. But this? This was ancient history, cosmic horror, and galactic danger all wrapped into one. And now he was stuck in the middle of it. A new problem. Ronan let out a long sigh. All right. So let's say I believe you. What now? Silena looked at him, something desperate in her expression. I need to find the archive. The what? The last records of my people, hidden before the fall. If they exist, they might have a way to stop the echoes. Ronan frowned. You mean kill them? She hesitated. Yes. Ronan didn't like the hesitation. What aren't you telling me? Silena clenched her jaw. There may be another way. Ronan didn't break eye contact. And what way is that? Restoring them. Ronan stared. You mean bringing those things back? Making them people again? His voice was sharp. Are you insane? Silena's expression was unreadable. They were once like me. They tried to cheat death, and it turned them into monsters, Ronan shot back. You really think they deserve to be saved? Silence. Silena's fingers trembled slightly. Wouldn't you try to save your own people? Ronan opened his mouth, then closed it. Damn it. She had him there. A dangerous path ahead. Ronan groaned, rubbing his temples. So where's this archive? Silena's shoulders relaxed slightly. A place called Valetha's Rift. Ronan stiffened. Valetha's Rift? You mean the cursed graveyard in the dead zone? Silena nodded. Ronan exhaled. You really know how to pick destinations, don't you? She gave him the faintest hint of a smile. Ronan shook his head, standing up. Fine. We'll go. But I swear, if this turns into some eldritch horror nightmare, I'm charging you for emotional damages. Silena's smile widened, just a little. Understood. Ronan sighed. Something told him he was going to regret this. Whispers in the void. The nightfall drifted through the vast expanse of space, its trajectory set for Vailitha's Rift, a place most people only spoke of in hushed whispers. Ronan had been to a lot of dangerous places in his time, but even he knew better than to wander near the rift. It was a graveyard of lost ships, a void of broken metal and shattered dreams. And now, thanks to his terrible decision-making skills, he was heading straight for it. He glanced at Silena, who sat silently in the co-pilot seat, her silver eyes fixed on the viewport. She hadn't said much since their last conversation. Ronan didn't blame her. Finding out your entire species was doomed to eternal suffering wasn't exactly something you got over in a day. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was keeping something from him. And that? That worried him. The approach. The ship's scanners flickered erratically as they neared the rift. Ronan frowned. That's not good. Silena's gaze remained fixed on the swirling nebula ahead. The rift distorts technology. Great, Ronan muttered. I love flying blind. A static-laced warning flashed across the controls. Unstable gravity well detected. Proceed with caution. Ronan tightened his grip on the flight controls. Alright, we're coming up on it. If you've got any brilliant last-minute ideas, now's the time. Silena finally looked at him. Stay close to me. Ronan blinked. What? She unbuckled her harness and stood, moving toward the viewport. The rift responds to presence. It can sense if you do not belong. That's incredibly vague. She turned back to him. Trust me. Ronan let out a slow breath. Fine. He didn't like this. He didn't like any of this. But at this point, he was in too deep to back out. Entering the rift. The moment the nightfall crossed the rift's boundary, the universe seemed to shift. The stars outside flickered, blinking in and out of existence. Debris drifted around them, the broken remains of ships that had ventured here and never returned. Ronan swallowed. I hate this place. Silena moved toward the control panel, her fingers tracing an unfamiliar symbol on the screen. A moment later, the ship's scanners flickered back to life. Ronan blinked. What the? Silena met his gaze. It recognizes me. Ronan's stomach twisted. That's not comforting. Silena ignored him, focusing on the coordinates ahead. The archive is at the center of the rift. Of course it is, Ronan muttered. Because why would it ever be somewhere safe? Whispers from the dark. As they pressed deeper into the rift, something strange began to happen. A soft, whispering sound filled the ship. It wasn't coming from the speakers. It wasn't coming from the comms. It was just, there. Ronan stiffened. Please tell me you hear that. Silena's expression was unreadable. They know we are here. Ronan's blood ran cold. Who's they? She hesitated. The ones who never left. Ronan clenched his jaw. Fantastic. Arrival at the archive. The swirling darkness of the rift parted suddenly, revealing a structure unlike anything Ronan had ever seen. It was massive, a floating monolith of ancient metal and glowing runes. The archive. The whispers grew louder as they neared. Ronan's grip on the controls tightened. I really don't like this. Silena placed a hand on his arm. You don't have to come. Ronan gave her a flat look. Like hell I'm staying on the ship alone. She almost smiled. Almost. A door to the past. The nightfall docked against the archive's surface, its landing gear settling onto an ancient platform. Ronan exhaled. All right. Let's get this over with. Silena stepped forward, pressing her palm against a carved symbol on the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the door shuddered. A deep, echoing sound filled the air as it slowly slid open. Beyond it, only darkness awaited. Ronan sighed. Of course it's dark. Why wouldn't it be? Silena stepped inside. Ronan followed, his heart pounding. Whatever answers lay within this place. He wasn't sure he wanted to find them.